The first laundry machine was invented around 1762 by a man named J. Gifford. It was powered by a horse that walked on a wheel. Have you ever wondered what laundry was like before machines? Well, this is my attempt at it. I have chosen to wash all of my clothes by hand today, using only natural materials to clean them. I'm doing things like using a wooden washboard, which is really rough on your clothes and your hands. And instead of soap, I'm going to use just water and some sort of ashes called The thing about potash is they're actually just burnt wood. You take wood and you burn it, and then you grind it up into a powder, and that makes your soap. But when it comes to cleaning clothing, the answer is kind of complicated. Like so, it works fine on grease stains, but plant-based oils like olive oil, for example, are very difficult to remove from clothing. And so people had to go to great lengths in order to find ways to make them more soluble in the water. One of the things people started to do is add salt to their washes, because salt increases the water's ability to suspend particles within it, helping keep them from redepositing onto the fabric. Another trick people used was urine. Urine has ammonia in it, which is alkaline, and that helps break down acids and proteins. In the Middle Ages, urine was often collected from animals and also people. So the next step after washing the clothes is to dry them. Drying racks existed during the Middle Ages, but I don't have one of those. And if I did, it would be full of wet clothes right now. So I've hung my clothes up on the line outside. They'll be very stiff when they're dry. That's because I'm using linen as my main material today. Linen is made from flax, and flax is incredibly tough when it's processed correctly. And so I've been told that the quality of linen could even be compared to modern Kevlar. After everything is dried out, it's time to iron my clothes, and I'm using an old-fashioned cast iron flat iron now. One thing that might surprise you about these clothes is how dark they are. Most clothing during the Middle Ages was dyed with natural materials, and a lot of those materials were plants. However, not all plants produce bright colors. Plants like walnut and onion skins produce purples, blues, and blacks. Now, I've chosen to wear black for my medieval peasant garb today because I think it suits me. But it's also the color most commonly found in textiles from the Middle Ages. There are many reasons why people might have chosen to wear this color. For one, darker colors can help hide stains. It's much easier to disguise dirt on a dark garment than it is on a white one. Additionally, dye materials to be dark colors required fewer resources than brighter ones. To produce a dark blue or purple dye, you just needed to soak your fabric in boiling water along with whatever plants you want to extract the dye from. However, producing yellow, red, or green dyes required special equipment called a mordant. Mordants are special chemicals that you have to treat your fabric with before you put it into the dye bath. Otherwise, the dye molecules won't bond with the fabric. Yellow, red, and green dyes were considered luxury colors because of the extra cost required to produce them. But they were also popular because they were the colors of the royal family. And so peasants who wanted to look like their betters might have chosen to wear them. Lastly, darker colors probably helps people stay cooler in the summer heat. Dark materials absorb heat better than lighter colored ones, making them better suited for hotter climates. Now it's time to do something completely different. This is my attempt at recreating medieval shoes. I'm taking inspiration from a pair of 14th century shoes currently housed in the British Museum. They're made entirely of leather, with the uppers being stitched onto the soles with a simple running stitch. The pattern is incredibly simple, but there are certain techniques that I hope I've gotten correct here. For example, the piece of leather that goes between the toes is called a vamp, and in order to make sure it lays flat, the edges were overlapped and sewn down. Along the sides of the vamp, you can see where the threads have stretched over time, and in order to combat this, I've added these little triangular pieces of leather along the sides. These are meant to reinforce the seams and keep them from stretching any further. Before stitching up my uppers, I've got to add the insoles, which will hold the shape of the shoe when it's not being worn. When the shoes are finished, they will be loose. That's because back in the Middle Ages, people wore their shoes with thick woolen socks. These were meant to cushion the foot and also absorb sweat. Since they were made of wool, these socks were biodegradable, unlike my modern synthetic ones. And so, if a person died while wearing them, the sock would eventually just disintegrate into dust, leaving the shoe totally wearable for whoever came across it. And now it's time to make a medieval tunic. My pattern is inspired by the 14th century find-in tunic, currently held by the Royal Ontario Museum. This is a rare example of a tunic with its original lining intact. It's made from linen with a head hole cut out of it. Then 2 slits were added on either side to form the arm. From there, the whole thing was just hemmed. Tunic like this were likely worn throughout Europe from the 12th to the 15th centuries, though this one dates specifically to the 14th century. I'm trying to make mine look as close to the linden one as possible, but since I don't have a loom, I'm just weaving a plain rectangle. Once the rectangle is done, all I need to do is seam up the side and add the sleeves. The neat thing about this tunic is that the fabric doesn't fray, which means I don't need to finish the edges of the fabric. If the ends unravel, I can just weave them back in. However, I am finishing the bottom edge, because I do want my shirt to unravel and end up looking shapeless. It's pretty satisfying too, so on this old-fashioned treadle sewing machine. It's from the 1800s and it takes quite a bit of effort to make it work, but it's fun to try and match the stitches to the tunic. When making medieval pouches, you usually take a piece of fabric and fold it over itself and then stitch along the sides and the bottom. Then you add drawstrings so you can cinch the pouch closed at the top. But I wanted to try and make something a bit more complex. This pouch is inspired by one currently in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's made from wool and has a very interesting construction method. First, the sides of the pouch were gathered at the top and then sewn together, forming a tube. Then the bottom of the tube was gathered as well and attached to the sides. The last step is to finish the top, and I'm doing this by adding a leather strip that has 2 holes punched into it. This will allow me to run my drawstring through it and keep the pouch closed. Making this pouch taught me that sewing projects from the Middle Ages aren't always have to be super simple. Yes, a lot of them were, but there were also people with incredible skills who made beautiful artifacts from leather and fabric. And the clothes were not kind. Think the dirtiest laundry you've ever washed. Now imagine that basket woven from human hair, soaked in blood and excrement, smelling of decay and death. That was a common load for any medieval washerwoman. In fact, cleaning tabards, tunics, and hose stained with all manner of bodily fluids and refuse was a normal part of the job. Sure, some nobles had servants wash their own clothes, and for some peasants, family members cleaned their own linens. But where there were people, there was filth, and someone had to clean it. Thus, wherever there were settlements, there were washerwomen. Today, we're going to dive into the reeking world of medieval laundry, why it sucked to be a medieval washerwoman, and how even the cleanest person could get filthy quick. First off, being a washerwoman wasn't so much a profession as it was a necessity. Most households simply did their own laundry, a task often relegated to women and children who had time to spare between, say, tending animals, making cheese, and brewing beer. For nobility, domestic staff handled clothing maintenance, though that didn't necessarily mean laundering things. A master tailor might alter a nobleman's garments, but that was hardly the same thing as scrubbing them clean. And it was an uncommon practice for upper classes to have specially designated laundry maids, especially outside France, where such work was usually performed by a servant already assigned to other duties. So while the laundry maids of Paris might have had cushy laundering gowns and cravats in heated rooms, their country cousins were more likely elbow-deep in frigid river water, cursing the cold and whatever lord had sent his wife's hose to them to clean. Medieval washerwomen were most commonly independent contractors. In other words, they were their own bosses. They set their own hours, though those were dictated by the seasons, and found their own clients. Business was rarely steady. Much of their work depended on weather, and many washerwomen took on other tasks when they weren't scrubbing clothes, such as weaving baskets or mats or darning stockings and tights. When business was slow, they might even sell their services as midwives or wet nurses. The very definition of washerwomen was broad. In some places, the term included anyone who washed clothes, whether their business was small-scale or massive. In others, the title was reserved for those whose trade was exclusively laundry. To complicate things further, some washers operated out of their homes, taking in soiled clothes and returning the clean stuff later, while others brought their tubs to clients' doors. Then there were professional laundries run by religious orders or wealthy individuals who employed multiple washerwomen to meet demand. Despite the variability, one thing was universal. Medieval washerwomen were low on the social rungs, often unmarried or widowed women. They were frequently considered outcasts, particularly if they worked on other people's clothes. The reason confounding logic, it seems, but the clothes carried intimate traces of their owners, body oils, personality, style. Working on another's wardrobe was akin to handling their most personal effects. In many places, married women were forbidden from doing other people's laundry. It was seen as improper to touch another woman's clothes, even if they were nothing more than a widow's weeds. Unmarried women had fewer restrictions placed on them, but because they were also considered more vulnerable, they often faced criticism for choosing such a profession. Moreover, washerwomen lived and worked outside the domestic sphere. They were rarely in charge of managing households, and thus they were neither wives nor mothers, two of the only acceptable roles for women in medieval society. As a result, washerwomen were easy targets for men looking to abuse those they deemed lesser. Living on the fringes of communities offered little protection from roving bands of soldiers, passing nobles, or really anyone who thought a poor washerwoman would make an easy victim. In fact, her work by the water might have been the most dangerous part of her day, for the privacy offered by tall banks and thick brush were also perfect for isolating a lone woman from the rest of the world. But let's assume our washerwoman is safe, or at least safer than she might be otherwise. What does her life look like? Well, for starters, she probably doesn't have much choice in the matter. If she's working outdoors, she has to go where the water is. Rivers and streams were the primary resource for cleaning clothes, and those bodies of water were rarely located in town or village. Most settlements, after all, were built away from large bodies of water to prevent flooding and disease, leaving washerwomen to trek to creeks and streams on the outskirts of communities to do their jobs. They needed to bring supplies such as soap, food, firewood, and places to stay overnight, which meant they had to haul everything on their backs. It was a rare washerwoman who had an animal companion to help carry her gear. Many used boats to shuttle themselves and their tubs across larger rivers or stretches of marshland. Although this, too, required brute strength, it was uncommon for boats to tip over and for washerwomen to arrive at their destination soaked to the bone, which is a fate our washerwoman is likely to suffer in any season. In winter, it was unpleasant but bearable. Spring and fall brought rains and mud. But summer was unbearable. Not only did the heat intensify the stink of soiled clothes, but it also made the water level lower and thus harder to work with. Scrubbing up against rocks, tree roots, and whatever else the riverbank provided was about the only way to clean fabrics. And since rubbing soiled items against hard surfaces was an occupational hazard, washerwomen suffered more than most from split and bloody fingers. Not to mention that everyone wanted their clothes washed during warmer months. Summer was high season, meaning washerwomen were busier and wealthier than usual, but also more exposed to the elements. And don't forget the lice. They bred on dirty clothes and thrived in warm weather, meaning summer was peak infestation season. Nits were impossible to remove with mere scrubbing, even with special tools. Their eggs were glued to hair and clothing so fast they required combing to remove them. Medieval washerwomen dealt with these tiny terrors by dumping entire baskets of clothing into nearby ponds or rivers, letting fish and other wildlife feast on the critters. Afterwards, the fish would be caught and served up as a supper, a nice protein source that came with the territory of washerwoman. Though obviously if she'd hauled her own fish to the water's edge to eat for lunch, she'd rather toss those back into the stream and keep on scrubbing, given the hazardous nature of the occupation. It's surprising that washerwomen weren't paid better, but they rarely made enough money to live comfortably. Generally, payment was based on the amount of work, the fabric type, and the client's social status. A peasant might pay a few pence or a loaf of bread for cleaning a shift or a tunic. A knight esquire might pay more, and a lord might reward a washerwoman handsomely for cleaning his velvet robes, though he might also throw her a gold coin and call it a day. Regardless of rank, customers often tried to haggle prices down, and there was little a washerwoman could do to stop them. After all, it was not uncommon for several washerwomen to work in the same area. Competition was fierce. Those who charged much risked going without work. Those who charged too little risked losing money. In the end, most washerwomen earned next to nothing and struggled to survive. Even in summer's bounty, they were rarely able to save money. And when winter arrived, they often found themselves deeper in debt, buying extra firewood to keep themselves warm while working. So what made someone become a washerwoman? Perhaps they had no other option. Perhaps they were fleeing an abusive spouse. Perhaps they just preferred the freedom of working alone to the drudgery of domestic life. Whatever the reason, once a washerwoman, always a washerwoman. Unless, of course, you had sufficient funds to retire or find a husband who could take care of you. Otherwise, you'd spend your life perpetually drenched in cold water, knee-deep in filth, and surrounded by vermin. And if that sounds bad, wait till you hear about the Black Death. Do you ever feel like your clothes are getting a bit too stinky? Has your gym bag started to reek even after several washes? Well, my friend, you clearly don't have it nearly as bad as these folks whose laundry is so filthy it starts to glow. So grab some wet wipes and get ready to clean up your screen, because this history hot tip is going to be one heck of a wild ride. When we think of dirty laundry, we typically imagine ourselves, our day-to-day activities, and the less savory aspects of living in close proximity to other humans. In fact, we have entire catchphrases dedicated to this kind of We talk about people being so dirty, they need to go straight to the nearest car wash and be hosed down with soap and water. But for as long as humans have been around, there has always been something far more disgusting than that. And no, we aren't talking about the laundry baskets in locker rooms. In order to understand the true meaning of filth, we first have to understand the main components that make our own dirt. And if you know anything about history, know that we haven't had indoor plumbing for most of it. The lack of basic sanitation meant that human beings were constantly exposed to all kinds of microscopic organisms. These microbes would live on things like bed sheets and clothing, which, if we're honest, probably didn't look or smell much different than what a baby wipes commercial would try to sell us as fresh and clean. And that S because the dirt that we usually think of as being gross is unactually gross at all. It's simply bacteria. But in order to get an idea of what really dirty laundry might have looked like, we first have to know how our modern laundry detergents work. When we do laundry, we use hot water in combination with chemicals to break up the bonds between those tiny little bits of soil that got stuck to our clothes when we were out and about. These are things like pollen and grass clippings. But of course, there are also those times when we spill food or, God forbid, bodily fluids onto our clothes. When we wash our clothes, we add detergent to help break up these organic compounds. Then we rinse them away. Now, even if you've never taken a laundry class, you already know that washing machine can only do so much. There are plenty of items that we can't throw in the washing machine. like that one shirt your grandma told you not to worry about. Or how about your prom dress that you'll never wear again? In cases like these, we take our clothes to the dry cleaners, who use a whole host of chemical solvents to clean clothes that can't get wet. So let's say you have a shirt that's covered in grease stains. Dry cleaners will use a solvent called perchloroethylene, which goes by the nickname PERC for short. This solvent is so effective at dissolving grease that the dry cleaners themselves sometimes get covered in it. Now, you may have heard recently that the EPA has determined that this chemical is dangerous to both the environment and human health. But back to our grease-stained shirt. After soaking in this solvent, it gets rinsed with water, which pulls any remaining trace of the chemical away from the fabric. Then the shirt is dried and pressed to make it look nice and new. This process, however, is not without its waste. While the water used to rinse the clothes does remove the majority of the solvent from the fabric, it doesn't always get all of it. Sometimes traces of PERC can be found in the water used to press the shirt as well. Alright, now that we understand how modern laundry works, let's go back in time to see what dirty laundry used to look like. One of the worst combinations of smells you can possibly imagine is the commingling of heavy wool, sweat, lice, and worse. You can picture it, can't you? Heavy wool soaked with days of sweat, laced with lice and worse, ground in with soil, dung, and kitchen grease. Imagine the smell, not sharply pungent, but thick and earthy, the musk of musk. The scent of lives lived close to animals, to hearths, to labor, a dense scent that clung to fibers like sorrow. But the washerwoman knew every stain, every speck of dirt, the source of each one. She knew the secret language of soiling and could read a shift or a stocking much like a book. For her work was not just physical, it was social. She handled the most intimate evidence of daily life. Bloody rags, soiled shifts, linens from sick days. Her hands, rough and worn, yet gentle, coaxed the dirt from the fabric of people's lives. And yet for all their closeness to others, washerwomen often lived apart. Their work was necessary, but it was also dangerous. As a washerwoman, you were closest to the body's illnesses, the impurities of the community. You were privy to the private matters that unfolded within households, privy also to the secrets people kept hidden, and thus washerwomen were frequently regarded with suspicion. They could be accused of stealing things like jewelry from clothing and babies from cradles. Like many who worked in the service of others, washerwomen were simultaneously indispensable and suspect, respected and feared. The profession was mostly an occupation of women and girls, both free and enslaved. For instance, during the American Civil War, washerwomen were a key part of the domestic sphere for both sides. For enslaved women, doing laundry was a task that fell under the umbrella of domestic work, a responsibility that was expected of them regardless of their age. On plantations, enslaved people would complete their assigned field work and then head to the big house where they would cook, clean, and launder the clothes of their enslavers. If there were washerwomen employed on the plantation, enslaved women would still be tasked with helping out. And on top of the physical labor required to wash clothes by hand, they would have to deal with the psychological stress of knowing that if they did a poor job, they and their children would receive a whipping. Even in their leisure time, the mental toll of keeping their enslavers happy was a burden they had to carry. Enslaved people were forbidden from socializing with white folks, but they still had to keep in mind that they were always representing their people. Therefore, the enslaved had to make sure their clothes were always clean and well kept, since their appearance was reflective of how their enslavers were perceived in society. For enslaved women, the work wasn't over once the clothes were clean. They still had to iron them. And if you've ever tried ironing a shirt before, you know that it can be kind of difficult. Imagine having to do it by hand. For enslaved people, they would typically use a flat rock or brick, but they also had access to a special type of cooking called a sad iron. This was a regular cast iron pot with a flat bottom that could be placed over a fire and used as a makeshift ironing board. As you can imagine, this method was pretty dangerous, as any movement of the object could result in severe burns. Enslaved women would also have to contend with the heat generated by the fire needed to power the sad iron. Fires were hot enough to cause serious burns if you weren't careful, and caring for the fire took constant vigilance. A fire could spread out of control, destroy property, and even take lives, and that responsibility weighed heavily on the minds of enslaved people. In addition to the risk of injury, the smoke created by the fire would coat everyone in a layer of ash and grime. This coating would eventually make its way into their clothing and skin, creating a cycle of perpetual dirtiness. Free black women had similar concerns during the Civil War. While they were able to avoid the threat of whippings, they were still expected to maintain a pristine appearance, so as not to give the appearance of being unintelligent or lazy. In 1864, one black woman described how she did laundry for two families who both employed black washerwomen. But if the weather was bad, she had to do the work herself. She wrote, "I washed and ironed for two families. One colored woman washed for the other family. If it was rainy or cold, I had to wash and iron for both families." These accounts show how doing laundry was not just a chore, but a way of life for black women during the Civil War. While the circumstances were different for women of different races, both groups faced a great deal of adversity. Enslaved women had to maintain the appearance of wealth and cleanliness to avoid punishment. Free black women had to maintain a certain standard of dress to avoid giving the impression that black people were uncivilized. In both cases, the pressure to keep their clothes clean and well maintained was a constant source of stress. Now that you know how truly disgusting dirty laundry can be, maybe you won't complain the next time your mom tells you to clean your room. Dirty laundry. It's no one's favorite chore, but it's gotta be done. But I can think of few things worse than doing other people's dirty laundry. Not just because it's tedious and time-consuming and tiring, but because in medieval thought, if you handled the unclean, then you became the unclean. There was a kind of moral stain that lingered even as you rinsed and wrung and soaked the sins of others away. In the Middle Ages, washerwomen were poor, overwhelmingly female, and frequently widowed or unmarried. With few options, many turned to laundry as a means of survival. They washed for local inns, or for monasteries, or for the wealthier households in town, but rarely were they permitted inside the homes they scrubbed for. Instead, laundry was left out for them bundled and rank at the edge of the property, to be returned neatly folded and stiff with starch, or perhaps strung dry across thorny heads. Theirs was an unglamorous job, literally getting one's hands dirty and thereby losing one's own clean status. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and so washerwomen formed their own quiet communities. They've gathered in clusters along rivers or at communal washhouses, their voices a low murmur over the slap of wet cloth against stones. And so today we talk about dirty laundry, but also women who did other people's dirty laundry, and how they fared in the Middle Ages. Welcome back to the series. I'm your host. See, in medieval thought, there were some things you just didn't do yourself. You had servants for that. If you were wealthy enough, you had entire staffs. So you didn't have to sully yourself handling chamber pots or cleaning out stable or washing the family's soiled linens. For the lower classes, these jobs were necessary evils, and the folks who made money doing them suffered social stigma as a result. But nobody had a lower social status than the washerwoman, because her work kept her in a state of perpetual uncleanliness. While she was scrubbing and rinsing and wringing, she couldn't pray or read scripture or perform acts of piety. She had to leave the community of the clean to spend all day with the filthy rags of others. Also, as I said, she would pick up lice and fleas and assorted creepy crawlies and carry them home with her. At least, that's what people believed. The reality is that while these women did indeed battle lice and fleas, they weren't bringing them to the job. They were bringing the delousing remedies. One of the most common treatments was a lotion made of fresh or dried rue leaves mixed with vinegar or urine, and this would be applied to clothing as well as the body. This is likely where the theory that washerwomen were dirty originated, since urine was a key ingredient in much of medieval cleaning. Also, urine was sterile, thanks to the antibacterial properties of both milk and the amides found in urine, and it was sometimes used in surgical settings into the 18th century. Okay, maybe don't go around dipping your bread in the community bathroom. So let's say you were a medieval woman who found yourself in need of making money. Well, you might become a washerwoman. Widows, I said, were particularly susceptible to taking up this trade, given that their late husbands' family usually reclaimed his belongings and wouldn't necessarily leave it with much else. On top of that, widows were frequently shunned by society and forbidden from remarrying, which meant they needed ways to support themselves. Another group that took up the trade were young, unmarried women, particularly those who'd been accused of or convicted of a crime. Convicted felons in the Middle Ages could earn their freedom early by performing menial tasks like laundry for the families of the nobles. But even when they were freed, they were stigmatized as convicts and often remained in service to the same noble family. This makes sense, right? We want to keep our nice white clothes nice and white, and we do not want to risk the chances of our laundry person staining our expensive fabrics. You'd naturally want to hire someone with a reputation for cleanliness. But of course, these women were merely poor or stigmatized. They weren't actually dirty. It is just that they were forced to take on such a dirty job that they ended up being portrayed as such. Their daily rhythm was relentless. It began before sunrise and ended only when every garment had been scrubbed, rinsed, wrung, and laid out to dry. The first step in washing was sorting the laundry according to fabric type, color, and degree of white garments were soaked overnight in hot water, and lye substitutes like urine and wood ash. Then they were scrubbed vigorously using another lye solution and a wooden beater. Next came rinsing and wringing out the excess water. The clothes were then either hung up to dry or laid out flat on a clean surface to finish drying. The whole process had to be done at least once a week, and multiple times a week for inns and taverns, which inevitably attracted rowdy patrons who spilled food and drink and tracked in mud. And yet, despite their labor, washerwomen were rarely acknowledged in historical records. Their names fade, undocumented. Only occasionally do they emerge in court records, often accused of petty or in hospital rosters, marked down as laundresses who died of fever. Sometimes they appear in medieval illustrations, hunched over tubs or rivers, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, brows creased, but never named. They were invisible, but they needed to be fed, and when they were hungry, they'd snatch a crust of bread here, a piece of cheese there, and that was how the stereotype that they were thieves got started. They ate simply, as did everyone in the Middle Ages. and they dressed plainly. Their clothes were coarse, rough-spun wool, faded with use and patched many times over. Their aprons stained from long years of work. But these women carried on, with blistered palms and aching backs. They carried on because someone had to wash the garments. Someone had to scrub the seams from linen. Someone had to make life even a little more bearable for those who could afford not to get wet. For as unpleasant as it is to get dirty doing the laundry, it's far worse to be stuck wearing those dirty clothes. After all, in the Middle Ages, the act of bathing was considered essential for public health. Public bathhouses were common in medieval towns and cities, as well as along major trade routes, and some inns even boasted baths for weary travelers. The church even weighed in on the matter of cleanliness, demanding that Christians bathe not only for health reasons, but to avoid smelling like wool peasants. Imagine having your sins washed away with your stinky tunic. But while public bathing was fairly common, private bathing was rare. Bathing was time-consuming, required a lot of heated water, and having a tub in one's house was an extravagance most couldn't afford. In addition to the practical difficulties, there was also some stigma attached to having a bath in your home. Baths were associated with paganism, and Christian women were warned that bathing too frequently would encourage sexual immorality. These women knew that. They worked for clients who regularly enjoyed baths and had ample hot water in their homes, but they weren't allowed to join them. Ironically, a few decades ago, American presidents were regularly criticized for not bathing enough. While today I've heard a few historians suggest that perhaps we should tone down the daily showers. Think about that. Our modern culture encourages us to bathe only once a day max, while medieval culture considered showering multiple times a week and it was expected that those who bathed would employ washerwomen to clean their clothes afterwards. But remember, they were supposed to be dirty. So the next time you find yourself surrounded by a mountain of dirty laundry, remember the washerwomen of the Middle Ages. Remember how they scrubbed and rinsed and wrang without complaint. Remember how they battled lice and skin disease and never complained. Remember how they were poor and tired and constantly hungry and never stopped working. Remember them, because they are not remembered with statues, but their legacy lingers, faintly, like the scent of lye on cold air, like the splash of water in a quiet, early dawn, just outside the village, down by the riverbank. And now, from the low, raw hands of the washerwoman, we turn to a very different figure. She was not quiet, she was not easily ignored, and she has not been forgotten. A woman who spoke loudly, felt deeply, and chronicled her life in words that still echo today. Let us meet Margery Kempe. Margery Kempe was born in 1373, most likely in the town of in Norfolk, England. Now, Margery's family isn't really important to our story except for one detail. Her father came from a long line of yeomen, and her mother was the daughter of a wealthy landowner. Therefore, while not necessarily rich, Margery had access to better opportunities than many girls of her time. At age 14, she married a wealthy merchant from Cambridge named John Kempe, and within 4 years, they had 2 children. But when Margery was just 21, John died and left her a widow with 2 kids and enough money to support herself and live comfortably for some time. As a young widow, Margery Kempe appears to have been rather free with her time. While there is no proof that she ever set foot in a university, she kept good hours, dined well, and spent her days reading books. In fact, she loved to read books so much that she even joined the book trade at one point, hiring scribes to copy texts and then selling them for a profit. Margery was also deeply religious and took great pains to fulfill her obligations to God. And this is where our story truly begins. In 1393, Margery embarked on a pilgrimage to the shrine of Our Lady at The journey took her over 100 miles north from Cambridge, and she walked barefoot the entire way. It was a popular pilgrimage site, and Margery stayed in hostels along the route as she made her way there. When she arrived, she visited the shrine, prayed, and then began the journey home. But while walking back, Margery fell down a flight of stairs and injured herself. This caused her to remain in a village court for several months until she recovered. During her stay, she began having visions of Christ, Mary, and other saints, and she started hearing voices commanding her to go on pilgrimages to visit holy sites in Jerusalem and Rome, so she did. Over the course of the next 8 years, Margery Kempe traveled extensively throughout France, Spain, Italy, and the Holy Land. She walked the roads barefoot, slept under the stars, and subsisted on what people gave her, only occasionally spending money on necessities like clothing. Now, you may think this sounds rather saintly, and you would not be wrong. But let's be honest, these kinds of behaviors were considered a little odd for a woman of her status. Margery wasn't a simple girl, she wasn't uneducated, and she certainly didn't need to travel the world begging for handouts. So why did she do it? Well, first of all, remember that Margery was having visions and hearing voices. So she genuinely believed she was following a divine calling. Secondly, she wanted to fulfill her vows of devotion to Christ. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Margery Kempe traveled because she wanted to see the holy places for herself. She had heard about them all her life, but she wanted to know what they were like, and she wanted to know them deeply. She couldn't just take someone else's word for it. She needed to experience it for herself. And she did. She saw the manger where Jesus was laid after his birth. She walked through the streets of Nazareth where he grew up. She stood in the Garden of Olives, where he prayed before his crucifixion. She even venerated the pillar of shame in the Temple of Solomon, where tradition said he was whipped. And nowhere did she hear a voice more clearly than at the spot where tradition said Christ was crucified. There, he spoke to her and told her that she was the one who had put him up on the cross with her own sins. Hearing this, she understood that she needed to dedicate her life to his service. And so she did. From 1400 until her death in 1438, Margery Kemp traveled widely, though less adventurously than before. She had a local base from which she launched her devotional trips, and she hired servants to assist her on the road. Even so, she continued to live a life of poverty, sleeping under the open sky and wearing rough clothing. She was recognized by almost everyone in England, and sometimes people wanted to help her. But Margery turned down financial gifts, saying that she could not accept anything that she did not earn. However, she made an exception for her beloved sister, who she allowed to assist her in her travels. As a couple, they were known for their zeal and enthusiasm and their devotion to Christ, and Margery wrote of her sister, "I never found no creature that so loved God as she did." And when her sister died in 1428, Margery was inconsolable, crying out, "Alas, when shall I have such joy as I had in my sister?" Though Margery Kemp's brother-in-law accused her of unseemly behavior, perhaps in an effort to control her, Margery refused to stop mourning her sister for weeks, and this, too, was part of her devotion. Like Julian of Norwich, Margery Kemp wrote down her visions and experiences in a book, and she wrote it in Middle English, the language of the common people, rather than Latin, as was customary. She titled it The Book of Margery Kemp, and it became the first autobiography written by a woman in the English language. It is full of vivid descriptions of Christ, Mary, and the saints. It details her interactions with common people and church officials, and it describes her response to the sights and sounds of the Holy Land. The book is also full of Margery Kemp's personality, her hopes and dreams, her fears and frustrations, and even her sense of humor. She was indeed a lively character. When Margery visited Rome, she complained bitterly about the number of beggars and how they annoyed her. But when she reached St. Peter's Basilica, she saw a beggar and asked for a piece of red bread that hung around his neck. He declined to give it to her, and Margery said, "Well, then I shall have your head shaved." And so the Pope's barber shaved the man's head, and Margery took the bread and ate it, saying it tasted sweet as honey. She was not always so bold, however, and she frequently clashed with church officials over her behavior. While visiting the Holy Land, she had a vision of Christ. Then she went to confession, but the priest would not absolve her sins, because he did not believe that she had actually spoken to Jesus. Frustrated, Margery told him, "You shall know well right now whether I have seen him or no." And then the priest felt Jesus' wounds in his own hands. Still, Margery Kemp remained deeply devout, even when those around her did not understand her actions. And yet Margery Kemp remains a controversial figure. Her visions were often dismissed as delusions, and she was mocked for her behavior. In fact, she was taken to a mental institution for observation and declared sane. Some people accused her of heresy, and she was investigated multiple times by church officials. Margery was also criticized for her book, which was deemed a course for polite society. But despite all this, Margery Kemp lived her life as she saw fit. She continued to travel, speak to whoever would listen, and write down her thoughts and visions. And in doing so, she paved the way for future female writers, and she gave voice to generations of English women. When Margery Kemp died, perhaps around 1438, people were glad to see the back of her, as far as they knew at least, because nobody knows for sure where she died. We don't even know for certain how she spelled her name. It appears in records as Kemp or Camp. In Latin, it was sometimes Kempia. By all accounts, her death went almost unnoticed. No epitaph survives, no monument, not even a grave marker. Unless, that is, the base of a cross in a churchyard is enough. The base bears the initials MK and the date 1438, which may well be the year of her death, though it cannot have been pleasant. She was ill, her right side paralyzed, her speech impaired. She dictated her final will. Then she died. That much we know. What we do not know is how many people attended her funeral, if any at all, or whether anyone wept for her. There are signs that at least one person did. Margery Kemp was an enigma. While she shocked and appalled, while she defied every norm of behavior, of dress, of religious practice, there was something undeniable about her, something unforgettable. After her death, someone wrote down her story, writing in Latin in the early 1500s, probably around 1520, and entitled it The Book of Margery Kemp, the first autobiography in the English language. It is a book filled with contradictions. Margery was uneducated and yet learned enough to write down her thoughts. She was a wife and mother who rejected domesticity and family life. She was deeply religious and yet critical of many aspects of the church. She traveled widely but always returned home. She wanted to be an anchorite, a woman who lived in a kind of hermitage attached to a church, but could not endure the solitude. Margery Kemp was also highly controversial, and yet the subject of hagiography, a book intended to make her into a saint. Her life was a bewildering mix of devotion, madness, controversy, humility, and pride. Marjorie Kemp's story began in East Anglia, in the market town of King's Lynn on the north coast of Norfolk. Today it is best known for its Georgian architecture and elegant Georgian houses, but in the late Middle Ages it was a center of trade and wealth. Marjorie's father was an official in the customs house, and his work brought him modest prosperity. Marjorie grew up in a large house in the town. One can imagine her running through its rooms, playing in the garden, listening to sailors, tales of faraway lands. She would have attended the Mass at St. Margaret's Church, just as her father did, watching the townspeople go about their daily business, hearing them speak the language of the Welshes, the Old English term for the English people. Marjorie was born into a Christian household, a Christianity infused with local pagan traditions and beliefs. The countryside around King's Lynn was dotted with holy wells, places where people went to bathe, to drink, to pray. Magic, too, was part of everyday life. Women were known to carry charms, to use folk remedies. Belief in witchcraft was widespread. When Marjorie was a young girl, a woman accused of witchcraft was burned at the stake in nearby Great Yarmouth. She grew up in an age of profound social change. The Black Death had swept across England in the mid-1300s, killing perhaps a third of the population. Labor shortages led to higher wages, greater mobility for some people. For others, however, there was hardship and misery. Marjorie was born into a world that was changing rapidly, and she changed with it. As a teenager, she met and married a man named John Kemp, a merchant from a well-to-do family. They had 4 children together, 3 sons and a daughter, and settled into what must have seemed a comfortable life in King's Lynn. Yet Marjorie never felt at ease. The home she had entered turned out to be a prison, and after the birth of her 4th child, her mental state disintegrated. Marjorie was overwhelmed with images of demons chasing her, clawing at her, trying to drag her down. She described these visions later as horror, pain, and anguish. She recalled feeling helpless, like one possessed, screaming and foaming at the mouth. This continued for 2 years, during which time she rarely slept and often did not eat. The neighbors in her close-knit community watched her in horror, whispering behind cupped hands. Eventually, her husband took her to church and had her tonsured, cutting off her hair as a sign of a trespass against God. Still, nothing changed. One day, when she was beside herself with fear, Marjorie collapsed at the Julian and Norris Chapel in King's Lynn. There she fell into a deep slumber from which she awoke transformed. The terror had gone. Instead, she experienced overwhelming feelings of love and peace. Looking back, she realized that this was the moment she had heard the voice of Jesus Christ. From that moment forward, everything changed. Marjorie became convinced that she was chosen by God, that she had a special mission. She wept copiously, her face pale, her whole body shaken. She visited churches, standing wrapped in worship, or kneeling before altars, lost in prayer. She spoke to Christ, and she said he spoke back. The first thing he told her was to go home to her husband and children. He wanted her to live her life according to God. In other words, he wanted her to be a Christian, the best Christian she could be. At first, she followed his advice, but it was not long before she started to travel walking, barefoot from place to place, begging for food and lodging, visiting holy sites, healing the sick, helping the poor, preaching to men and women, and talking to church officials about her relationship with Christ. She soon became notorious. People came to watch her, to mock her. Some believed she was mad, but many wanted to believe that she really was chosen by God. Marjorie was not deterred by criticism. She continued to travel around East Anglia, then further afield, across England and Wales. She was summoned to see church officials. She was denounced as a heretic, as a witch, as a woman possessed by the devil. She was beaten, flogged, imprisoned, and yet she refused to stop. And then she decided to take her case to Rome. She set sail with a group of merchants for the continent, making her way to the heart of Europe, staying in convents when she could afford it, sleeping rough on the streets, begging when she couldn't. Along the way, she encountered other mystics, those who shared her beliefs, and those who mocked her. She was arrested several times, particularly in France, and thrown into jail. Once she was locked up in a tower in Paris. After 6 months, she escaped, fleeing to Normandy, where she spent a year living in poverty before crossing back into England. Over the next few years, Marjorie continued to travel, going to Ireland, then returning to England, then back to Ireland. During one visit, she scaled the Hill of Terror, an ancient seat of Irish kings, and prayed at the top. On another occasion, she walked into the sea up to her waist and raised her arms toward heaven and began to preach. All the while, she was carrying a heavy cross and wearing a hair shirt under her clothes. She remained undeterred by beatings, imprisonment, or illness. Marjorie Kemp was arrested for the last time in 1415. She had been accused of heresy and other crimes. Bishop Henry Despenser threw her into prison, intending to force her to recant her views. But after 5 months, he let her go, allowing her to keep her possessions and wear decent clothing. Perhaps he thought he had broken her. In fact, he had made her stronger. Marjorie went to the continent one last time, visiting Rome, northern France, and Germany, where she stayed for 10 years until her health failed. She moved from place to place, surviving on charity, enduring blindness, paralysis, mockery, and probably, we can assume, more arrests. In the end, she died alone, perhaps in Cologne, where her bones may lie. As for her story, it survived thanks to an unknown scribe who recorded her astonishing life and compiled the first autobiography in the English language. At every holy site, she would fall to her knees, weeping, overcome with what she described as divine ecstasy. At one point, she claimed to have experienced a mystical marriage with Christ himself, a spiritual union of soul and Savior. People rolled their eyes. Others prayed for her. Many simply walked away. But Marjorie was not deterred. She knew what she had seen, what she had felt, and most remarkably, she made sure the world would remember. Sometime in her later years, likely in her 50s, Marjorie dictated her story to a scribe. She couldn't write herself, but she could speak. And speak she did. The result. The Book of Marjorie Kemp, widely considered the first autobiography in the English language. It is not an easy read. The style is circular, repetitive, emotional, and filled with lengthy spiritual dialogues. Marjorie refers to herself in the third person, this creature, as if she were both author and subject. She recounts her visions, her trials, her many journeys. She records every time she was insulted, misunderstood, or threatened. She documents her prayers in painstaking detail. And yet, through it all, a strange, compelling rhythm emerges. You begin to hear her voice. Earnest, exhausting, utterly sincere. Marjorie Kemp was not trying to be liked. She was trying to be truthful, and her truth was uncomfortable for those around her. And sometimes for herself. She lived at a time when women were expected to bear pain quietly, to grieve with dignity, to serve without question. But Marjorie sobbed. She preached. She fought with priests and scolded bishops. She refused to sleep with her husband. She insisted on being heard. And now, more than 6 centuries later, her words still echo. Her tears, once mocked, now ripple through literature classes and theological studies. Her madness, once condemned, is re-examined as mysticism, or trauma, or perhaps something else entirely. We don't need to decide what Marjorie truly was, only to acknowledge that she existed, that she spoke, that she lived a life very few women were permitted to live, and left behind a document that very few women ever could. So if you ever find yourself overwhelmed, noisy with feeling, too much for the world around you, think of Marjorie. She was, in many ways, far too much, and still, she wrote. Let's take a moment to look at the structure of this video. This piece is a creative writing piece based on the life of Marjorie Kemp. There are several things about her life that made her a fascinating subject for a piece like this. The first is that she is considered by some to be the first woman to write an autobiography in the English language. She dictated her life story to a scribe, but she couldn't write herself. And so, the very fact that she wanted to write her life story, the first one in English, is really interesting. Also, she lived during a time when women weren't allowed to really do anything. They couldn't own property. They couldn't go anywhere without a male relative. They were basically seen as property themselves. And Marjorie went against all of that. She traveled extensively, and not only in England, but in Europe, in France, in Spain, in Rome. She wanted to go to the Holy Land, but she wasn't able to. And she also really goes against the grain of what women were supposed to be. She has visions. She has mystical experiences that she just has to talk about and share. She is incredibly emotional. She cries a lot. She laughs a lot. She really sort of rejects the constraints placed upon women at the time. And because of that, she is often called hysterical or mad or a heretic. And so to write a piece from that perspective was very intriguing to me. The idea of someone who is so different, who goes against the grain so much, and yet is so sincere in everything that she does and everything that she believes. And finally, I love the fact that she leaves a legacy behind. And by that I mean we have this incredible document because of her. And even though she was mocked during her lifetime, after she died, she became very important to feminist literature, to theological studies, to history. And so the fact that she was able to leave a legacy behind, despite the fact that she was so mocked during her lifetime, that really inspired me. Now, there are several themes that run throughout this piece. One is identity. Who is Marjorie? What does she believe? How does she view herself? How do other people view her? Is she mad? Is she a heretic? Is she a saint? What is her legacy? That is one theme. Another theme is vision versus reality. Does Marjorie see things that other people don't? Does she have mystical experiences that are real to her, but not necessarily real to everyone else? And how do we reconcile that? We also have the theme of writing and legacy. Does Marjorie want to be remembered? Why does she want to tell her life story? And will anyone listen to her story? Will anyone care about her story? And if so, how will they interpret her story? And finally, we have the theme of hysteria. During Marjorie's lifetime, she was often called hysterical, mad, a lunatic. And that's because she did not behave like women were supposed to behave. Women weren't allowed to laugh out loud. They weren't allowed to cry. They weren't allowed to be overly emotional. And Marjorie was all of those things. And so the piece looks at the word hysteria and what that meant then and what that means now. Hysteria was actually a clinical diagnosis until 1980. This piece uses second-person narration. I chose to write in second person because I wanted the audience to really inhabit Marjorie's body. I wanted them to feel what she felt. I wanted them to understand how she saw the world. And second person allows us to do that. Second person also blurs the line between past and present. And that is really important to the piece because I want the audience to understand that what Marjorie went through, what she experienced, how she was treated, still happens to women today. Women are still laughed at, women are still dismissed, women are still called hysterical, women still deal with patriarchy. And so second person helps establish that connection between past and present. Another thing I'm really interested in this piece is tone. Tone is so important because Marjorie's tone is so particular. It's circular, it's repetitive, it's earnest, it's exhausting, and that's intentional. I wanted to reflect Marjorie's exhaustion. I wanted to reflect her sincerity. And so the tone of the piece is really important. And finally, I'm interested in the issue of voice. Whose story is this? Whose story gets told? Whose story gets remembered? And I'm interested in amplifying Marjorie's voice. Marjorie didn't get to tell her story during her lifetime, and so I wanted to make sure that in this piece, her voice was front and center. In terms of audience, I think this piece can speak to anyone who's ever been called too much of anything. If you've ever been called too much of an introvert or extrovert, too much of a thinker or a dreamer or a believer, I think this piece is for you. Anyone who's ever been mocked or ridiculed or laughed at or silenced can connect with this piece. And lastly, my hope for this piece is that it will continue to amplify voices that have you and traditionally been amplified. Voices of women, voices of people of color, voices of the LGBTQ community, voices that have been marginalized, voices that have been silenced, voices that have been I want to make sure that those voices are heard and that those stories are told. Richard III was born in 1452, the son of a man who would become King Edward IV. As he grew up, Richard earned a reputation for being a fierce fighter, brave and strong, but also a calculating strategist. In fact, many think he's the prototype for the classic Machiavellian character. Yet it's important to remember that Richard wasn't born evil. Like all of us, he was shaped by his experiences. And as he grew up, those experiences made him desperate to survive. In medieval England, the royal family tree was more complex than your average family reunion. Cousins were king, uncles fought alongside nephews, half-brothers competed for the throne. All the while, the seeds of discord were planted. For example, Richard's father, Edward, had married a woman named Elizabeth Woodville without asking permission from his own father, which caused a rift between the two men. Then when Edward IV became king, he appointed Elizabeth's brother, John, to the powerful position of Lord Chamberlain, angering the rest of the royal family, including Richard. And to make things worse, as Edward's health deteriorated, he designated John as his heir instead of Richard. So when Edward IV died in 1483, Richard found himself at odds with both his own father's wishes and the powerful Woodville family. With each passing day, Richard's sense of entitlement grew stronger. His half-brother, the new King Edward V, along with Edward's mother and sister, all owed their positions to the Wood. That's why Richard seized his chance to take the throne for himself. He claimed that Edward's marriage was invalid, making the young Edward and his brother and then he threw them in the Tower of London, hoping to snuff out any potential claims to the throne. As we know, Richard didn't raise the boys to rule. Instead, he locked them in a tower and claimed the throne for himself. But was he really behind their disappearance? Well, it's impossible to say. There are three main theories about what happened to the princes in the tower. The first theory is that Richard simply had the boys killed. Given how much he wanted the throne, it isn't too hard to believe that he might have ordered the execution of his rivals. However, there is little evidence to support this theory, and Richard's record has no direct connection to the killings. The second theory suggests that the princes were kept in hiding for a time. This is based on the writings of a man named John Kendall, who was a servant in the household of Elizabeth Woodville. According to Kendall, Richard promised Elizabeth that if she agreed to marry one of his friends, he would allow the boys to live. However, Kendall's account was written nearly 100 years after the fact, and some scholars believe he was motivated by a desire to slander Richard. Other historians argue that Kendall's memories are faulty, and that he was misremembering what happened. Either way, the idea that the princes were hidden somewhere for a time is an appealing one. It gives us hope that they weren't killed, that they may have grown up in secret and lived full lives. However, the third theory is the most popular among historians today. It's known as the fence or frame theory, and it proposes that Richard deliberately kept the princes in the tower in order to use them as pawns against his enemies. By holding the rightful heirs hostage, Richard could ensure that none of his rivals were trying to depose him. Unfortunately for Richard, though, his plan fell apart. When his enemies didn't move against him, he had them released. The problem is nobody knows exactly when or how they escaped. One of the most frustrating things about this case is the lack of physical evidence. There are no documents connecting Richard to the boys' deaths. No one witnessed what happened in that tower, and the skeletons found under the staircase may not even be the boys. They were identified in 1674, but that identification was based on little more than the fact that they were found in the tower. Over the years, Experts have argued about whether the bones belong to the princes, but no one can say for sure. It's possible that they will never know. The bones have remained undisturbed for so long that they may be too fragile to extract DNA. And even if DNA could be extracted, there aren't any living descendants of the princes to compare it to. In addition to the lack of evidence, there are also a lot of gaps in the historical record. Richard's actions are poorly documented. In fact, most of what we know about him comes from his enemies. This isn't unusual. During the Wars of the Roses, both sides tried to discredit each other, so they spread rumors and wrote stories that portrayed their opponents in a bad light. Unfortunately, this makes it difficult to separate fact from fiction. We may never know the truth about what Richard did or didn't do. As we consider this case, we must keep in mind that Richard was the victim of propaganda. 2. His opponents wanted him to seem like a monster, so they wrote stories that portrayed him as cruel, vindictive, and untrue. Yet these stories may have gotten it wrong. Maybe Richard wasn't such a bad guy after all. Maybe he was just desperate to survive. Think back to when Richard was a kid. His father didn't love him, his grandfather never approved of him, and his half-brother was keeping him from the throne. If you grew up in those circumstances, you might feel a little resentful. 2. Richard was passed over for the throne not once, but twice. Once when his father chose Edward over him, and again when Edward chose John. But Richard didn't let it go. Instead, he waited patiently until his chance finally came. When Edward died and left a young child as his heir, Richard acted quickly. He wasted no time seizing the throne for himself. Now, let's talk about Richard's behavior towards women. While Richard certainly had romantic relationships, he never married. But some people claim that this doesn't mean he wasn't capable of intimacy. After all, Richard wasn't exactly known for his discretion. He was often seen laughing and joking around, and he was known for his quick wit. In fact, there are reports that he was quite the ladies' man, and it is hard to believe that someone who was so comfortable around women would be able to form intimate relationships with them. When we look at the accusations against Richard, it's clear that he was a controversial figure. There are plenty of reasons to dislike him, but maybe there's more to the story. Now, let's examine what Richard's legacy reveals about our society. First, let's talk about the nature of power. Richard was a man who craved power more than anything else in life. He was willing to do whatever it took to get what he wanted, and in the end it cost him everything. Richard's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition. It reminds us that power corrupts, and that those who seek power above all else will ultimately destroy themselves. Next, let's discuss the role of propaganda. Richard was the victim of propaganda, plain and simple. His enemies wrote stories about him that portrayed him in a negative light, and these stories have lasted for centuries. In fact, Richard is one of the most vilified figures in history. But what if there's more to the story? What if Richard wasn't such a bad guy after all? This is a reminder that we should always be critical of the information we consume, and that we should unbelieve everything we read. Finally, let's talk about the importance of empathy. Richard was a human being, just like you and me. He had feelings and emotions. He experienced joy and sorrow, and he made mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes were big mistakes. But that doesn't mean we should forget that he was human. We should remember that Richard was a product of his environment, a man who was shaped by his experiences. He wasn't born evil, he was born innocent. And it was only through his experiences that he became the monster that we know him as today. For centuries, he was cast as the villain, a symbol of ambition gone mad. And yet, modern historians have begun to question this. Was he really so monstrous? Or simply a man doing what many others had done, seizing power in a brutal age? Richard III was killed in battle in 1485. His crown found in a thorn bush. His body hastily buried. For centuries, his grave was lost beneath the paving stones of a parking lot, only rediscovered in 2012. His bones, when found, showed signs of scoliosis. Not a monstrous deformity, as Shakespeare claimed, but a curved spine, a human flaw. He was reburied in solemn ceremony in Leicester Cathedral, with dignity restored, and still, the princes lie elsewhere, perhaps beneath stone, or in another part of the tower. The truth has faded into the mists of Tudor propaganda, medieval whispers, and bones without names. And yet, the mystery lingers, a soft hum beneath the surface of English history. Because even in the calmest corridors of power, secrets remain. Because sometimes, we lose the light, and the laughter of two boys echoes only in stone. Now, we turn once more from shadowed towers and royal intrigue, to another world entirely quiet, gilded, and perfumed. A world where women wore veils, not for mystery, but for modesty. Where politeness was a weapon, and embroidery a full-time occupation. Let us now open the doors of the manor house and enter the world of a medieval lady. The sun streamed through the leaded glass windows of the solar, illuminating motes that danced in the current of air. Warm light fell across the work table where Isabella sat, stitching by the hour, her needle flashing, her brow creased in concentration. Beside her lay a half-finished piece of work, a magnificent display of medieval feminine art. Running stitch outlined the delicate petals of a daisy chain that wove around a spray of hawthorn blossom. Each leaf painstakingly formed, each vein delicately traced. Within the circle of blossoms, a tiny initial, I, for Isabella, proclaimed ownership of this, the latest in a series of such works. Her fingers nimble, her movements precise. The work demanded both patience and precision. Such skills were not innate, but learned, practiced patiently until they became second nature. But why should Isabella bother so to perfect these skills? She was a baroness, after all, not a peasant girl with dreams of noble patronage. Why did she need to embroider? Because embroidery was a tool. It could secure advantageous marriages for eligible maidens and ensure the prosperity of her household. This particular piece would grace the wedding bed of one of her cousin's daughters, a girl whose father was in line for a bishop. Such a desirable piece would surely make an impact. And every completed work meant another notch on Isabella's belt, another demonstration of her value as mistress of her household. Just as a merchant keeps accounts of his yearly trade, so Isabella kept count of her handiwork. Every finished piece noted down with its eventual placement recorded in a little book kept beside a work table. There, she would also note down patterns and designs she wished to try, or record ideas for future pieces. Each entry was dated and some were illustrated with tiny sketches. One such sketch showed a mythical beast, part lion, part eagle, with wings outstretched, its beak agape in a silent roar. Another displayed a knight tilting in a tournament, his visor thrown back, his lance held high. These drawings were not Isabella's alone, but made by a professional artist whom she employed to copy designs from illustrated books. Though herself quite untalented in this area, Isabella loved beautiful things, fine fabrics, exquisite jewelry, and objects d'art of every description. She possessed several exquisite tapestries that covered her walls with scenes from classical mythology or biblical stories. She had a cabinet full of jewelry, hair, ornaments, and girdle clasps, each crafted with precious metals and stones. In fact, it was through her love of fine things that Isabella first came to need. As a young girl, she would have been taught the basics of embroidery as part of her general female education. Later, when she married and took up residence in her own home, she was expected to fill her days by practicing and refining her skills, always with an eye to their application in securing advantageous matches for herself and her daughters. Hours upon hours were spent bent over a frame, surrounded by an array of silks, linens, gold thread, scissors, thimbles, and cushions. Isabella would have worked alongside her daughters and female servants, their needles flashing in unison as they filled the house with the murmur of voices and the soft clatter of pins. They might have worked on a single piece together, a collaborative effort that demonstrated the bounty of the household. Or each woman might have worked on a different project intended to adorn clothing or household goods of her immediate family. Whatever they created would be evidence of the prosperity of the household and the diligence of its mistress. Isabella's collection of jewelry and other personal ornaments would have arrived as part of her dowry when she married, brought to her by her father, the Duke of Berry, who doted on his favorite child. The vibrant colors of her ceremonial robes were carefully chosen to complement her complexion and enhance her status. Her veil was pulled low to obscure her face when she greeted important visitors, a sign of feminine modesty in an age when women of status rarely revealed themselves in public. She would have worn a corset, though perhaps less severe than those of later centuries, laced tightly to give her figure the desired shape. Her skirt, full and wide, would have been supported by a stiff understructure, and her gown, square cut and modest, would have concealed most of her figure, save for the fashionable length of her tight sleeves. Isabella's hands, carefully manicured and adorned with fine rings, would have moved with practiced ease as she stitched away the hours. She would have been perfectly aware of her position in society and the expectations placed upon her as a result. She understood the importance of good works and of displaying her skills to advantage, for Isabella was not merely a baroness. She was the king's sister, the daughter of the king's brother, and she would have been expected to display her royal blood in everything she did. While Isabella's hands flew, her mind would have been far from idle. Medieval life, while seemingly simple, was full of complexities. Isabella would have needed to keep track of her husband's comings and goings, manage the household in his absence, and ensure that the estate ran smoothly. She would have supervised the preparation of meals, ensuring that no expense was spared. Her table would have groaned under the weight of meats, fruits, cheeses, and breads, reflecting the prosperity of her household. And always there would have been politics, for Isabella's status meant that she was constantly on the lookout for suitable machias for herself and her daughters. She would have received ambassadors and dignitaries, listened to the gossip of traveling merchants, and kept an ear to the ground for news of any advantages that might accrue to her house. All the while, her needle flashed, weaving patterns that spoke of her status, her skill, and the wealth of her royal family. As the afternoon waned and shadows lengthened, Isabella set down her work, rising stiffly from her chair. Years of sitting had made her somewhat bent, and she winced as she rose, careful not to let the pain show. Her eyes, however, still shone brightly, and her smile was quick to appear as she greeted her ladies-in-waiting as they entered the sola, bearing fresh linen and brightly colored silks. Theirs was a life of privilege, theirs and those like them, but a life lived within strict bounds of decorum. Isabella's day had been filled with work and her evening would be too, for she would spend the night spinning tales and jokes with her ladies in waiting, laughing softly and speaking in hushed tones, so as not to disturb the household peace. In the flickering candlelight, she and her companions would weave stories, sharing gossip and news from across the kingdom. Sometimes they would speak of kings and queens, of dukes and duchesses, their words carefully weighed as they discussed the comings and goings of the nobility. More often, they would speak of younger matters, of eligible bachelors and their accomplishments, of dowries and prospects, and of parties and pageants held across the realm. Such diversions provided welcome breaks from the endless rounds of sewing and socializing that filled a lady's life. The glow of candlelight reflected in Isabella's eyes, her smile softening the lines etched deep into her face by years of endless embroidery. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, but within the safety of her manor walls, Isabella felt only the warmth of companionship and the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent. For in her world, a lady's work was never done, but her legacy could endure through needle and thread, woven into tapestries that spanned generations. A lot of misconceptions surround the clothing worn by men and women in the medieval period. Men in particular have been depicted as wearing terribly itchy male shirts next to their skin, which would have been pretty uncomfortable. Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we are going to look at the undergarments worn by medieval men and women and try to separate fact from fiction. So let's jump right into it. We can be grateful that, thanks to the rather salacious nature of Henry VIII's court, we have detailed records of the clothing worn by men in the 16th century, particularly by Anne Boleyn and other members of the French and Italian courts. These pictures show us that the 16th century was very similar to the rest of the medieval period in many ways. Most men started the day in a linen shirt, usually reaching to the knees and sometimes extending further down the leg. Some men opted for shorter tunics, which would be tucked into hose or pants. Shirts would be made of wool, hemp, linen, or cotton, and were frequently darned and patched as they were passed down from one wearer to another. The sleeves were often cut away and reused as patches. Gentlemen would frequently embellish their shirts with beautiful French or Italian designs. They might also opt for a large collar that could be further enhanced with ruffles and lace. This was the garment that would be seen during formal events, as the top of the shirt would be buttoned up to the neck, or the ruff would take up all of the space between the shirt and the outer garments. The simple folk would likely not have such fine fabrics or embellishments, but would have worn their everyday shirts until they literally fell apart. In general, shirts were not clean garments, as bathing was infrequent, and only the very wealthy could afford to buy and maintain multiple shirts for regular changing. You will notice from these portraits that the gentlemen are not wearing anything underneath their shirts, but this was not necessarily the case in everyday life. Men of the lower classes would have worn a smock or a sleeveless tunic next to their skin. Smocks were designed to protect the shirt from dirt and sweat, and this practice of wearing an under-tunic was probably adopted from the military. Soldiers needed to stay as clean as possible, and so wearing a dirty under-tunic instead of a good shirt made sense. Sometimes men would wear just a smock as they went about their business. Tunic would have protected a man's shirt from the elements and from damage as he worked his trade. It would also have aided him in keeping his shirt clean, making it last longer and retain its value. For the commoner, his clothing was important, as it was often a hand-me-down or a very expensive purchase that would be paid for in installments. A man could also use his tunic as a sort of apron, wrapping it around himself as he butchered meat or repaired a roof. The soldiers, hunters, and laborers would have probably worn fitted tunics, while a man who worked in a shop might have worn a more comfortable, looser tunic. As a side note, some women wore fitted linen under tunics called a smock frock. This was necessary because women's clothing, especially the skirt, was much fuller than men's clothing. The undertunic allowed the wearer to move more easily and kept the outer tunic looking neat and tidy. Bras and drawers are terms used interchangeably throughout the medieval period. They can refer to the padded underwear worn by men, but they also refer to the baggy pants worn over the underwear. These were loose-fitting and gathered at the waist, sometimes with a drawstring. They were made of linen and were very loose to allow maximum airflow. They were intended to absorb sweat and reduce chafing. The wealthy man would have many pairs of bras and drawers. He would have worn a fresh set whenever he took a bath, which would have been fairly regularly. The lower classes would have worn the same pair of undergarments for days, if not weeks, at a time when toilets were not available and full-body baths were uncommon. Things can get pretty ripe down there. Undergarments would have smelled atrocious after a long period of time and would need to be washed often. Because these undergarments were seldom washed, they would be extremely uncomfortable. In addition, the fabric would become quite brittle and stiff, especially in the groin area where the most strain and sweat would be put on them. One can only imagine how uncomfortable they must have felt against the wearer's skin. Despite being in close contact with the groin area, these undergarments did not include any padding. The codpiece was introduced to men's clothing during the Renaissance, After the end of the medieval period, the wealthy elite would have worn a nightshirt while sleeping. This would have been made of linen or wool and would have hung down to the feet or ankles. Some nightshirts were made long enough to wrap around the legs and secure with a girdle. This would have been comfortable for the wearer and practical in bed. The simple folk were less likely to wear Sleeping naked was quite common. Even the very wealthy were known to sleep without clothing. Although Henry VIII did require that his courtiers wear silk, these were probably to enhance their masculinity, as the king had some issues with the virility of his male courtiers. Medieval women's clothing has become famous for its extreme nature. Women either wore very tight clothing that accentuated their curves, or they wore clothing that hid their figure completely. There was little middle ground. Let's see how common women and elite women differed in their undergarments. For the common woman, the only real undergarment was a linen chemise, similar to the men's shirt. A chemise reached to the mid-thigh and would have been tucked into the waistband of a woman's skirt. It was not necessarily a clean garment and would have been darned and patched as it became damaged. The length of a chemise varied depending on the occasion. A long chemise could reach to the feet or ankles, while shorter chemises would have shown just below the skirt. The wealthy elite would have worn an undertunic or a smock that reached to the knees or ankles. This would have helped hold up their skirts and protect their clothing from getting dirty. Elite women would also have worn linen underdrawers or a pair of padded shorts. These would have been very comfortable, especially when riding a horse. During the later medieval period, women began wearing a corset, which was a tight-laced bodice that helped pull in the waist. Corsets were not as restrictive as they would become in the 19th century, but they were certainly constricting. Women's clothing in the medieval period was incredibly complex. Skirts alone could have 20 or more yards of fabric, and it took many women hours to dress each morning. Dresses and gowns were frequently changed during the day, and many women had as many as 30 dresses just for a single season. Undergarments helped hold up heavy skirts and gowns, but they also assisted women in donning and doffing their clothing during the day. The wealthy elite had many sets of undergarments and could change several times a day. The poorer women would have worn the same chemise and underdrawers for extended periods of time, and these would have become quite contrary to popular opinion. There is little evidence that women wore bras. Straps were used to hold the breasts in place, but they were typically made of leather or tightly woven fabric. There is no evidence that women wore underwear, but wealthy women may have worn a pair of padded drawers for riding or playing tennis. It seems that medieval clothing was very dependent on one's social class. The wealthy elite had many garments for different occasions and could afford to replace their clothing often. The poor suffered with ill-fitting, smelly garments that were often uncomfortable against the back through the layers of history. Back to 2023, where we find ourselves once again in the very same place that we were at the beginning of this story, outside St. Paul's Cathedral. But there is a difference. We are no longer standing as tourists admiring the grandeur of London. Instead, we are Londoners who have just been to a funeral, who have just buried the king. The year before, Charles had ascended to the throne after the longest and most public mourning period of any monarch in British history. Now he lies dead in the very same cathedral whose bells tolled for him when he first came to London all those years ago. The weight of the crown has finally claimed another victim. They say only two can wear it, but three must die for it. First the Queen, then the King, and now someone new will rise. William, the heir apparent, is next in line. He and his wife Kate stood stoically beside the coffin as it was lowered into the grave. The new king is already shouldering his burdens. And why are we here? We ask. Why are we gathered in the square? How has this affected us? Surely this man's death is of no consequence to us. We know nothing of kings or queens. We live our lives according to the whims of the modern world. Well, let me tell you, there is more connecting us to this moment than meets the eye. For what happened here today is not the first time a monarch has died. This very square is steeped in the blood, sweat and tears of generations past. It is brimming with the echoes of their lives. Those who built these very walls around us knew nothing of iPhones or Instagram, but they too were as connected to each other then as we are now. Beneath our feet, the soil is alive with the stories of centuries past. As I look up at the top of this great dome, remember that it was built by the genius of Christopher Wren, the very architect who designed the sprawling palace of Versailles, the playground of the Sun King Louis XIV. But unlike Versailles, which still stands proud today, St. Paul's has seen better days. It burned down during the Great Fire of London, only to be rebuilt stone by stone on the same foundations. It has survived 2 world wars, and right now, we are standing within its shadow, because it has seen one too many funerals. It is a place of grief, of loss, of endings and beginnings, a place where lives converge and diverge, a place where kings are born and die. It is also the place where Oliver Cromwell seized power and outlawed the monarchy altogether. That man who beheaded Charles I now lies beneath the very altar where we are standing. A life for a life. The king gives one. takes one. You might think that we are so different from those who came before us, but as I stand here among the crowds, I see the same emotions flickering across faces. There is anger and despair, sadness and acceptance, shock and numbness, even joy. What an extraordinary mix of feelings to have at a funeral. And yet these are but a few of the emotions felt at any funeral, then or now. Nothing changes. The fundamental truths of human experience remain constant. Death touches us all, whether we like it or not. The king is dead. Long live the king. If these four walls could speak, if the very stones could come alive, they would tell you tales of love and loss. Of a young boy who lived in the shadow of this very church. He grew up watching the comings and goings of royalty. He saw kings crowned and die. He saw queens arrive and leave. But he also saw ordinary people going about their daily lives. Shopping, laughing, eating, praying, gossiping. He saw children play in the streets, dogs bark and chase their tails. He saw lovers meet, friends embrace. He saw merchants hawk their wares and beggars hold out their hands. He saw life in all its rawest forms, its beauty and its pain, its triumph and its tragedy, its hope and its despair. As he grew older, he realized that this place was more than just a church. It was a microcosm of the world. It was a place where the grand and the humble, the powerful and the powerless, the living and the dead were all brought together under one roof. He realized that the king was only human after all. The queen, too, was mortal. She, too, would die and turn to dust like the rest of them. He realized that the pomp and circumstance, the rituals and traditions, the crowns and the scepters meant nothing in the face of death. All were equal in the eyes of God. Now, almost 700 years later, we find ourselves drawn to the very same place. We come from all corners of the globe to pay our respects to a dead king. We have heard tales of his life and reign. We have read about his struggles and triumphs. We have watched him evolve from a young prince to a doting father to a devoted husband to a steadfast monarch. We have seen him navigate the treacherous waters of public life with grace and dignity. We have marveled at his ability to endure and overcome adversity. We have been inspired by his commitment to duty and service, but now we are here to pay our respects to the man behind the crown. We are here to mourn the loss of a king. Yes, but also to celebrate the life of a man. We are here to say goodbye to a public figure who has graced our screens and graced our lives for so many years. We are here to show our support for a family who has endured unimaginable scrutiny and sadness. We are here to show our solidarity with a nation that is grieving the loss of a monarch who has been a constant in their lives. As we gather here, we find ourselves connected to all those who have come before us. We are part of a shared human experience, bound together by our grief and our respect. We may not know the king personally, but we feel as though we do. We have seen him grow up. We have watched him make his way in the world. We have admired him from afar. We have respected him for his dedication to his role, for his commitment to his country. And now we grieve with those who loved him. We grieve with the queen who has lost her husband, the sons and daughters who have lost their father, the grandchildren who have lost their grandfather, the great-grandchildren who have lost a great-grandfather. We grieve with the courtiers and staff who have lost a boss, a friend, a mentor. We grieve with the people of London who have lost a landmark, a symbol of their city. We grieve with the people of England who have lost their king. We grieve with the people of the Commonwealth who have lost their head of state. We grieve with the people of the world who have lost a global statesman. We grieve because we have lost someone who represented something larger than himself, someone who embodied the values of duty, service, tradition and grace. We grieve because we have lost someone who made us proud, who made us feel good about ourselves, who made us believe in something greater than ourselves. We grieve because we have lost someone who was irreplaceable, someone who was one of a kind, someone who was truly special. We are here today to say thank you. Thank you for your service, your dedication, your sacrifice. Thank you for your courage, your strength, your resilience. Thank you for your kindness, your compassion, your empathy. Thank you for your humor, your warmth, your charm. Thank you for your leadership, your vision, your inspiration. Thank you for showing us what it means to be human, to be honest, to be real, to be true. Thank you for showing us the way, for showing us how to live, for showing us how to die. As we stand here today, we are united in our grief, but also in our gratitude. We are grateful to have known him, to have loved him, to have lost him. We are grateful to have been part of his story, to have been touched by his life, to have been inspired by his example. We are grateful to be here today, to be part of this community, to be part of this moment, to be part of this history. So today, we mourn the loss of a king. We mourn the loss of a man. We mourn the loss of a legend. But we also celebrate the life of a king. We celebrate the life of a man. We celebrate the life of a legend. We celebrate the life of Charles III. Ah, you seek me out at my evening post. Come then, weary traveler, and sit a while. For a little while longer, the firelight dances upon these stones, and I am but a humble purveyor of tallies, weaving words, until the morning light steals in. So rest yourself upon this old stool and tell me, What will it be tonight? A stroll along the Thames at midnight, or perhaps a visit to the tower, or best perhaps, if you have any choice, to follow me down into the heart of the earth itself, to where the lost voices linger and the secrets of ages slumber still. Secrets? Ah yes. What secrets are you asking about? Do you wish to know how London Bridge became so long and why the speaker in the tower became so hoarse? Or maybe you want to hear how the first humans learned their plights, and how the earth hearkened back with answers. All these things and more can be revealed, and yet they are not my own to give. No, those things lie dormant in places like this one, echoing within the chambers of memory. But here we are safe from the clamor of the day, and I might show you something that has lain undisturbed for 500 years. Have you heard of the washerwoman who walked barefoot behind the tide? She and others like her, they walk still. Only the moon knows their numbers. Ah, but you would follow them. Then come. We go when the sun dips low and the water laps at our heels. Here, beware the water's edge, for many a slip has happened there. Even my tread is unsure. There, I stumble over roots hidden in the rushing stream. The water is cold and sweet, dark and deep. It swirls around my legs, threatening to pull at my skirts and steal me away. I pull myself free and press on. Many a washerwoman has vanished thus, lost forever to the river's ceaseless flow. But I do not fear the water's pull. I know its rhythm, and it carries me towards the place I seek. There, on the bank, beyond a circle of flat stones, marks the spot. I tread carefully, as though treading on holy ground, for here, the mist hangs thickest and the veil between the worlds is thinnest. Here, the women gather closest. When the moon climbs high and the world is hushed in sleep here, I to become one with the endless murmur of the stream, one with the whisper of wind in reeds and the sigh of swans gliding silently by. And here, beyond the mortal ken, I hear the spirits sing. They sing of love and loss and longing, of battles fought and won, and life lived under skies both fair and foul. Oh, if only you could hear their songs. If only the air could hold them, shape them, bring them to the waking ear. But no, only in this liminal space, between worlds and waking, can you glimpse them, feel their presence woven into the very fabric of the night. You reach for me, and I am gone, and you are left alone, clutching at empty air. But wait, I am here still. Are you listening? Can you hear it? That sound just beyond the reach of hearing, the rustle of skirts, the splash of water, the murmur of many voices, all speaking at once and yet all in harmony. Listen well, for the washerwomen speak only to those who come with open hearts and quiet minds. Hush now, for their song is rising. They wash in the pale moonlight and chant in unison, their voices weaving together into tapestries of sound. With every stroke of water, they banish the dirt and grime of the day, of lives lived hard and full of sorrow. Their songs rise and fall like the tide, ebbing and flowing, ever changing, yet ever whole. In their rhythm, I find solace. In their words, strength. You reach for me, but you cannot touch. This world is not your own, not yet. Your feet are routed fast to the shores of wakefulness, and the washerwomen's world is slipping away, fading with the first hint of dawn. Do not grieve for them, nor for yourself, for even in parting, they leave a piece of themselves behind, a shard of their song, a stain of their magic. Hold it close and let it warm you until we meet again. And when the night deepens and the past drifts softly away, let us rest just for a moment in reflection. Now you wander the cobbled streets, dodging barrels and stray dogs. The stink of stale waste mingles with the scent of baking, bread and fresh roses. Above you, roosters crow, proclaiming the coming day, chasing away the remnants of dreams. In the fading firelight, you see the ghostly specter of a woman, clad in homespun gray, her eyes filled with an ancient sorrow. Her voice rings clear and true, echoing across the centuries. She speaks of love and loss, of faith and doubt, of hope and despair, and of dreams that dared not speak their name. And as she sings, you are drawn deeper into the heart of the city, to the very core of its beating pulse. Ah, you would stop and question her. But she fades as quickly as she appeared, leaving you alone in the labyrinth of time. Turn back now, if you like, while you still can, for the path back is growing dim. Yet you press on, drawn inexorably forward, seeking the source of her haunting melody. And there, nestled between towering structures that mock the heavens with their proud heights, you find a small chapel, its roof caved in, its walls crumbling, yet its spirit unbroken. Within these four battered walls, echoes of worship linger, mingling with the whispers of forgotten prayers. Here, amid the broken stones and stained glass windows, you encounter Margaret Chemies, a seer whose visions shook the very foundations of a kingdom. Her story is etched in the very fabric of the tower, woven into the stones and timbers, binding her to this place for all eternity. She stands before you, a vision of quiet defiance, her gaze unwavering, her Her lips move soundlessly, articulating truths that dare not speak their name. She shows you the depths of human potential, the heights of spiritual insight, and the enduring power of faith in the face of persecution. She reveals the tapestry of her visions, where angels dance with demons and the boundaries between heaven and hell blur. She whispers of cosmic truths and ancient prophecies, of cycles and changes, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. You reach out to touch her, but she melts like mist before the rising sun, leaving you alone with the ghosts of her revelations. As the shadows lengthen and the day wanes, you find yourself drawn to the whispering stones of the tower. Each rock monolith seems to hum with an energy that resonates deep within your bones. These stones bear witness to countless lives lived and lost, their stories echoing through the corridors of time. You trace the weathered surfaces, feeling the rough textures beneath your fingertips, and each touch sends shivers down your spine. Suddenly the stones come alive, and you find yourself transported back in time. Before you, two figures materialize, frozen in mid-stride, forever trapped in the heart of the tower. They had climbed these very steps with hopes and dreams in their chests, unaware that fate had other plans for them. They vanish, leaving you alone in the echoing silence, their story left unspoken, their fates unknown. Who were they? What brought them here? And why did they suddenly freeze in their tracks? You ponder these questions as you make your way to the top of the tower, each step taking you closer to the mysteries held within its ancient walls. Once there, you discover the Lady Isabella, a noble woman who scaled the heights of the tower with grace and determination. She sits upon a ledge, poised and elegant, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Her story unfolds through the very fabric of the tower, revealing a life lived with purpose and dignity. She speaks of her struggles against societal constraints, of her unwavering dedication to her craft, and of the quiet victories she achieved in a man's world. But as you stand before her, you sense a deep sadness emanating from the tower. It's a lament for a life cut short, for dreams left unrealized, and for the price of greatness. And then, as quickly as she appeared, Isabella disappears, leaving you enveloped in the solitude of the tower. The wind whispers through the gaps in the stones, carrying with it the faint echoes of her laughter and the rustling of her silken skirts. You remain rooted to the spot, savoring the lingering essence of her presence, knowing that though she may be gone, her spirit will forever reside within the heart of the tower. Ah, it's late, and the hour grows late. The night weaves its magic and the past stirs anew. The washerwoman chants her timeless song. The spirits of the city linger and whisper, and the voices of heroes and heroines echo through the stones. It's been a long journey tonight, hasn't it? And your path grows dim. Perhaps it's time to rest. But before you go, take a piece of tonight's adventures with you. Let it warm you through the long night. And when the sun returns, tuck it away safely within. For when the night deepens again, I shall be here waiting, ready to show you more wonders, unveil more mysteries, and share more secrets. Until then, farewell. Sleep well and dream of stardust and starlight.